They wanted to pay for our dream trip, 5-star resorts, cocktails over turquoise waters, private dinners under the stars. It was everything my girlfriend had ever wanted. But I said no. Instead, I suggested a budget road trip across the French countryside. And now, I can't help but wonder, did I ruin our relationship over my pride, or was I right to stand my ground? I, 28M, come from a family where hard work wasn't just a value, it was survival. Growing up, vacations were a luxury we could rarely afford, and when we did take them, they weren't extravagant. We'd pile into an old car, pack sandwiches for the drive, and spend nights in budget motels or camping under the stars. I have good memories of those trips, they were simple but ours. My girlfriend, 26F, on the other hand, grew up in a world I can barely comprehend. Her parents are extremely wealthy, and their generosity knows no bounds. Her car? A gift from them. Her wardrobe? Filled with designer labels they've funded. Even the apartment we share was partially covered by her family as a housewarming gift. From the moment we started dating, it was clear that her parents would always have a hand in our lives. But here's the thing, none of that is why I fell in love with her. It's not about the lifestyle or the comforts she grew up with, it's her. She has this way of lighting up a room, not because she's loud or attention-seeking, but because she makes people feel seen. When she listens, she's all in, and when she cares about someone, it's with her whole heart. She's fiercely loyal, too. If you're in her circle, she'll go to the ends of the earth for you. I've always admired the way she looks at the world, with a sense of wonder and excitement that's infectious. She's the type of person who'll stop in the middle of a busy street to point out how the sunlight hits a building just right or how the scent of flowers in the air feels like a tiny moment of magic. She makes me see life differently, in a way I didn't know I needed. That's why I didn't say anything at first. I figured, who am I to judge? That's just how her family works. I didn't care about the money or the gifts. I cared about her. But as time went on, it started to bother me. I want a life that we build together, something that's ours, not something her parents paid for. This all came to a head a few months ago when her parents offered us an all-expenses-paid trip to the Maldives. And I'm not talking about a casual beach getaway. This was a trip straight out of a travel magazine, overwater bungalows, private tours, 5-star meals, spa treatments, the works. My girlfriend was ecstatic. She immediately started talking about booking flights, planning outfits, and which resorts we'd stay at. To her, it was a done deal. But something about it didn't sit right with me. Don't get me wrong, the Maldives sounded amazing. I've seen the pictures, and who wouldn't want to wake up to crystal clear water and endless skies? But this wasn't just about the destination. It was about what it represented. I didn't want our first real trip as a couple to be something her parents handed us on a silver platter. It felt wrong. So, I suggested something smaller. Something we could afford together. I proposed a road trip through France, driving from where we live, stopping in small towns, exploring the countryside, and making our way to the Atlantic coast. We'd stay in budget motels or little inns, eat local food, and experience the country in a way that felt authentic and personal. The moment I brought it up, I knew she wasn't thrilled. She gave me this look, half disbelief and half annoyance, like I'd just suggested backpacking across the Sahara. Why would we do that, she said, when we could have a once-in-a-lifetime trip without worrying about anything? I tried to explain how important it was to me that we build something meaningful together. That I didn't want to start a pattern of letting her parents fund every big moment in our lives. But I could see it in her face, she thought I was being ridiculous. And honestly? Maybe I was. But the thought of sitting on a beach, knowing it was paid for by her parents, felt like it would cheapen the experience. I wanted something real, something we earned. When I brought up the idea of declining her parents' offer, the tension between us was immediate. She couldn't understand why I'd want to turn down such an incredible opportunity, especially when it was free. I explained as clearly as I could, it wasn't about the Maldives, or the money, or even her parents. It was about us, about starting our own traditions, creating something meaningful without depending on anyone else. She argued that her parents just wanted to help, that there was no harm in accepting their generosity. But to me, it wasn't just help. It felt like a safety net that we didn't need to rely on, not for this. I wanted to prove, to myself and to her, that we could have a great experience without anyone else footing the bill. The discussion dragged on for hours, circling the same points. She accused me of being too proud, and I accused her of being too comfortable letting her parents take over. In the end, she reluctantly agreed to my plan, though her reluctance was obvious. I took it as a small victory, not realizing how much resentment she was already carrying. I poured everything I had into planning the road trip. I mapped out a route that would take us through quaint towns, charming villages, and scenic countryside views on our way to the Atlantic coast. I researched cozy inns, affordable motels, and local restaurants that wouldn't break the bank but still had charm. I even made sure to include stops at romantic spots I knew she'd love, things like a lavender field and a historic chateau with breathtaking views. I wanted this to be special for both of us. But from the moment we hit the road, the complaints started, and they didn't stop. The drive, which I'd imagined as a chance for us to talk, listen to music, and take in the scenery, was too long and pointless. She'd sigh dramatically every time we hit traffic or had to take a detour, as if the entire trip were a personal affront to her. When we arrived at the first inn, I was excited. It was a quaint little place with creaky wooden floors and flower boxes in the windows. To me, it felt like stepping into a postcard. But to her? It was a nightmare. The room wasn't cozy enough, the bed wasn't plush enough, and the bathroom, God forbid, was ancient. She refused to shower, saying she couldn't possibly use a space that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. I thought maybe she just needed time to adjust, so I didn't push back. I figured the charm of the experience would grow on her once we got into the rhythm of the trip. But every stop seemed to worsen her mood. At a small countryside restaurant I'd read glowing reviews about, she barely touched her meal, poking at her plate before declaring the food boring and the ambience too rustic. At one point, I tried to shift the focus to the beauty around us. We passed through breathtaking fields of sunflowers that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The golden light of the setting sun made everything feel like a scene from a movie. "Isn't this incredible?" I said, gesturing out the window. She glanced up from her phone for half a second, shrugged, and said, "I guess. But it's not exactly the Maldives, is it?" That one stung. I kept trying, though. At every charming village we passed, I pointed out little bakeries and quirky shops, saying, "We'll have to stop there on the way back," or, "Doesn't that look like a fun place to explore?" She'd nod distractedly or give a half-hearted sure, but her discontent lingered, hanging over us like a storm cloud that wouldn't break. It wasn't just her words, it was the way she carried herself. She, who was usually so full of warmth and curiosity, seemed completely checked out. The laughter I loved, the spark in her eyes when she talked about things she was passionate about, it was like they'd been left behind the moment we left the comfort of her parents' money. Every little inconvenience seemed to chip away at her patience. A squeaky bed frame was impossible to sleep on. A minor delay at a toll booth was a waste of time. Even the weather, which I thought was perfect for a road trip, cool mornings and warm afternoons, was too unpredictable. I kept telling myself this was just an adjustment period, that she'd find the charm in the simplicity eventually. But the more time passed, the more I realized she wasn't just uncomfortable with the trip, she resented it. She resented me for suggesting it, for taking her out of the world she knew and into one where things didn't come effortlessly. The woman I loved, who could find joy in the smallest of things, seemed to disappear entirely when faced with cracked tile floors and handwritten menus. The way she looked at me, at the life I wanted to build, wasn't just disappointment, it was disdain. The breaking point came halfway through the trip. That morning, we had hiked through a beautiful countryside trail. The rolling green hills were dotted with wildflowers, the kind of view you see on postcards. I'd packed us a picnic, nothing fancy, just fresh bread, cheese, fruit, and some wine, and we found a quiet spot to sit and take it all in. For a moment, I thought things were turning around. But as we sat there, looking out over the hills, she finally snapped. "I hope you're happy," she said, her voice sharp. "This whole trip has been miserable. We could have been drinking cocktails on a beach, but no, you just had to prove a point." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe she would say that, after all the effort I'd put in to make this trip meaningful for us. I told her that I thought this was supposed to be about building something together, about creating memories that weren't handed to us. She fired back with words that stung even worse. "This isn't building anything. It's just embarrassing." That was it for me. I couldn't take the constant complaints, the jabs at every plan I'd carefully crafted, the feeling that nothing I did was ever good enough. So, I told her flat out, "If you hate it this much, call your parents. Let them fly you home. I'll finish the trip on my own." She stared at me, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and anger. It was as if I'd just said the most outrageous thing she'd ever heard. "You're serious?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. "Completely," I said, keeping my voice steady. "If this is so unbearable for you, there's no point in dragging it out. Just go." We didn't say much after that. She stayed quiet during the drive back to the motel, her arms crossed, her face turned toward the window. I could feel the tension in the car like a physical weight, but I didn't try to smooth things over. I'd reached my limit. That night, I watched her pack her things. She didn't slam drawers or throw accusations my way, she just moved methodically, as though she were already somewhere else in her mind. I asked if she wanted to talk before she left, but she shook her head and said, "There's nothing to talk about." The next morning, I stood in the parking lot as she loaded her bag into a taxi. Her parents had arranged everything, of course, a train ticket, a flight home, the whole works. She gave me a brief glance before climbing in, but she didn't say goodbye. I watched the taxi pull away, a mix of emotions swirling in my chest. Relief. Guilt. Sadness. The rest of the trip was Strange. Not what I had envisioned, but not entirely bad either. I drove the winding roads to the coast alone, the silence in the car both freeing and a little lonely. I spent hours walking along the beaches, feeling the cool Atlantic breeze on my face. I wandered through little seaside towns, stopping at cafes and bakeries where no one cared about my budget or my background. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel judged. I didn't feel the weight of someone's expectations pressing down on me. It was peaceful. But as much as I tried to enjoy it, it didn't feel like the victory I'd imagined. I wanted this trip to be something we built together, a foundation for a future that wasn't tied to her parents' money. Instead, it had become a stark reminder of just how far apart we were when it came to what we wanted from life, and from each other. By the time I reached the end of my route, standing on the windswept coast and staring out at the endless ocean, I realized the trip had changed something in me. I wasn't sure what would happen when I got home, but I knew one thing: I wasn't willing to compromise on the kind of life I wanted to live. When I got back, the apartment felt heavier than it should have. She was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Her suitcase was still by the door, as if she hadn't fully unpacked, and the look on her face told me this wasn't going to be a calm conversation. "You just walked in like everything's fine?" She started, her voice sharp. "After you ruined what could have been an incredible trip?" I put my bag down and took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I didn't ruin anything," I said, though even I could hear the frustration creeping into my tone. "I was trying to give us something real, something that didn't come with strings attached." She stood up, her movements quick and agitated. "Strings attached?" "It was a gift. My parents wanted to do something nice for us. They weren't asking for anything in return." "It's not about them asking for something," I shot back. "It's about us being able to do something on our own. I don't want to rely on them for every big moment in our lives." "Is that so hard to understand?" Her eyes narrowed, her voice rising. "What's so wrong with accepting help from people who care about us? Or is this just about your pride? Because that's what it feels like. You'd rather drag me on some miserable, cheap trip to prove a point than let us enjoy something amazing together." "Miserable? That's what you think?" I said, my voice louder now. "I planned every detail of that trip with you in mind. Every stop, every place we stayed, every meal, we were supposed to be doing this together. But all you cared about was what it wasn't. It wasn't a luxury resort, it wasn't 5-star, it wasn't handed to us on a silver platter. You didn't even try to see what I was trying to build with you." She shook her head, exasperated. "I didn't try? You forced me into that trip. You guilted me into going on some pointless road trip and made me feel bad for having a family that actually wants to support me. Do you even hear yourself? You're controlling, and you don't even realize it." "Controlling?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "Because I want a life we can stand on together, without needing your parents to bail us out? That's controlling to you?" She laughed bitterly, throwing her hands up. "Yes. It's controlling to demand that I live by your rules, to force me into your idea of what's right, and then act like I'm the problem for not loving it. Newsflash, not everyone grew up like you, and not everyone needs to prove their worth by struggling." I stood there, staring at her, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was too focused on proving a point. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the trip. This was about who we were as people, and whether we even wanted the same things. I finally spoke, my voice quieter now. "I'm not asking you to struggle. I'm asking you to try, to build something with me, not with your parents' money. I want us to have a life that's ours. Is that so much to ask?" She didn't respond right away. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, we could find some common ground. But then she said, "You don't want a life that's ours. You want a life that's yours. One where you call all the shots and I just go along with it." That was the moment I realized how far apart we really were. Her words hung in the air like a final blow, sharp and cutting, and I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. I didn't say anything else after that. What was the point? She grabbed her bag, her movements rigid, and walked out the door without looking back. The silence she left behind was deafening. I thought that was it, that we'd both take some time to cool off, figure out where we stood, and maybe come back to talk things through. But the next day, my phone started ringing. First, it was her mom. Her tone was icy and curt, the kind of polite venom that left no doubt about how she felt. "I don't know what's gotten into you, but you're being selfish. Do you know how lucky you are to be with someone like her? She deserves better than to be dragged down by your ego." I barely got a word in before she hung up. Then her dad called. His voice was calmer, more measured, but it didn't make his words sting any less. "I don't know what's going on between you two, but if you're not willing to step up and give her the life she deserves, maybe you need to rethink this relationship. She's used to a certain standard, and there's no shame in accepting help to meet it." Help. That word again. As if I didn't want to provide for her, as if my entire life hadn't been about working hard and earning everything I had. I thanked him for his input, gritting my teeth, and ended the call as quickly as I could. The messages from her brother were worse, blunt, angry texts accusing me of being a controlling asshole who didn't appreciate her or their family's generosity. She deserves someone who'll actually take care of her, he wrote. Not someone who wants to play martyr and make her suffer. The thing is, I wasn't surprised. I'd always felt like her family saw me as a project, someone to be molded and elevated to their standards. But now, it was painfully clear, they didn't respect me. To them, I was an obstacle, not a partner. For a while, the calls and messages left me questioning everything. Was I really selfish? Stubborn? Was I ruining something good because I couldn't let go of my pride? I replayed every argument in my head, trying to figure out where I went wrong. But then, late one night, as I sat in the silence of our apartment, my apartment, since she was still staying with her parents, it hit me. This wasn't about pride or ego. This was about respect. I wasn't asking for her family's money. I wasn't asking for handouts or lavish gifts. All I wanted was a relationship where we built something together, where every milestone was ours and not bought by someone else. Her words from that fight kept echoing in my head, you don't want a life that's ours. You want a life that's yours. But that wasn't true. I didn't want a life that was just mine. I wanted a life we could stand in together, equally, without the weight of her parents' expectations hanging over us. And if she couldn't see that, if she couldn't even try to meet me halfway, then maybe I wasn't the one who was being selfish. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Saying no to that trip wasn't a mistake. It was the first step toward understanding what I really needed in a partner. And maybe that realization came too late to save us, but it felt like the right decision for me. Now, as I stare at the packed suitcase still sitting in the corner of the room, untouched since I got back, I feel a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness because I cared about her, and I wanted this to work. Relief because I know, deep down, that this was the best decision I could have made, for both of us. If I had caved, if I'd accepted that trip, I would have spent every moment wondering when the next line I couldn't cross would come. And I can't live like that. I won't. So people, AITA for turning down her parents' luxury vacation and insisting we plan a trip we could afford ourselves? Was I being stubborn and letting my pride get in the way of something amazing? Or was I right to draw a line and stand up for the kind of life I want to build? I can't tell if I ruined something good, or if this was the wake-up call we both needed. What would you have done? Let me know in the comments.
Hey, did you love this story? Subscribe and turn on notifications for more.